Welcome to the Learning Reinvented Podcast, brought to you by myself, James Poletyllo, and the team from The Learning Effect. There are lots of learning podcasts out there, so we wanted to do something slightly different. This week, we're exploring how you can use cutting-edge tech and a performance consulting approach to really make a difference in your business. I'm delighted to welcome Lloyd Dean to the podcast. Lloyd, thank you for joining us today. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for having me, James. So I'm Lloyd. I'm currently head of digital and innovative learning at EDF. I suppose I'm passionate about learning, but even more passionate about trying to make an impact through our learning interventions.
Lloyd, one of the things we're really interested in is why people got into learning and development and what is their passion about learning and development. So what's your L&D story?
Yeah, I suppose it's more of an L than the L&D story. So I've always loved and been passionate about learning, been very curious. From a young age, and my dad, when we were younger, taught computer sciences, and later on did a PhD. So we always had technology kit, very young, a BBC computer and all of this stuff. So I was exposed to a lot of technology, that's the best way to say it, and maybe a digital native is a term to use. Then as I went through my studies at college and university, I became a teacher. I always wanted to be a teacher as well, and transmit my passion about given topics and just make an impact to people. I later became a teacher trainer as well. But basically at that point at teaching, I realized that I could use technology to make things a lot easier for myself and the students, and the grades would improve and I would do less marking and stuff. So I kind of automated some parts of marking assignments, because you go through and it'd be like a lot of repetitive comments that people would do, and then I would spend more time on the individual feedback point. But I also started to use, I taught anatomy and physiology, online custom games for diagnostic assessments, and I got to a point where I could kind of predict within roughly 10% if someone was going to pass or fail a particular unit. So point being, it wasn't a fad for me. It was something that was easy to use and made an actual difference. I then shared that with other people, other teachers, I should say. I did a few conference talks and presentations and stuff, and then I was approached by EDF, and I've moved through various roles with them. Initially, very similar to the stuff I've just mentioned in terms of modernizing learning. I then promoted into a team, done the whole, listen, what do we do with the LMS? And I suppose my current role, which I've been in since 2016, is to kind of strategize what we're doing for learning and technology, making sure it's in line with the business goals. So the learning and technology has always been a golden thread through my life and career, if I'm honest.
I think there's some really interesting points there, because you go back to when you're in teaching and thinking about how technology can help or aid any workplace or any, whether that's learning, but you start off with making your life easier, making the process more efficient, and I think that's a really obvious place to start. And again, a lot of learning tech sort of focuses on that, of making the admin life easier or making the processes easier. You're then talking almost predictive grades and things, which again is using data and predictive modeling and starting to think about how you're actually having an impact on the end goal. So I think there's some really interesting just sort of lessons there in terms of people stepping back, because I don't think, in my experience, people necessarily think enough about what the tech is there to do and how it's there to aid the whole process. And you shouldn't just be trying to make your life easier. You should also be trying to enhance learning experience, enhance performance, or whatever else it happens to be. But it's probably quite a confusing world for people who are out there and looking in, who maybe aren't techies, as you said. You sort of naturally inclined to be moved towards tech as well, and a lot of the people in learning space aren't. So what's your view on tech and sort of how that works in terms of aiding that experience? Is there any tips you can share or thoughts on the best use of technology?
Yeah, I think first of all, it helps to know the problems. Problems is a loose word, isn't it? But things we could improve. Use the word efficiencies. So when I was teaching, let's say, one of the challenges was that people, you would have a scheme of work you would deliver, and people would deliver the same scheme of work, maybe 10 or 15 years. And so they knew exactly what to do and when. And so the motivation to show individuals things could be better or improve for them and the learner was tough. You know, one of the lines I used to give to my final year of teaching is like, hey, I've done no marking at home this whole year. Got a lot of friends and enemies from that statement, to be honest. But but if I then take the concept of, you know, the individuals I've worked with over the years at EDF, there are some who, you know, they've done their face-to-face training in a traditional way, or it's always worked for them. So why should or do they need to change? And I think understanding someone's world definitely helps, rather than saying, hey, this technology is great, I'm great, and you should do this. Spending time to understand their world, understand their challenges. I suppose the modern word we might use for that are kind of personas, but again, I think that's quite loose. But really seeking to understand the individual so you can then work with them. Because I think a lot of the use of technology, the use of changing something is really driven by a motivation as well. So I think understanding someone's personal motivation. COVID was a really, of the last 12 months, COVID was in many ways, from a digital learning perspective, very helpful, because it removed, for some of our business units, it removed the conversation. It moved the conversation from a place of this has to happen, and from my team's perspective, it was what can we do to help with this in a more specific way. So it's more of an open door, to use a cliche. So yeah.
So let's pick up on that COVID point as you've touched upon it. So, you know, COVID has brought forward or sort of made it real for people, or forced people into a space that maybe they didn't want to go or weren't ready for yet, or hadn't, you know, were looking at a 2-year project to do something. Suddenly things had to happen overnight. So how did you help those teams through that transition of, you know, suddenly you've got to embrace tech and use it? What were the things that worked for you?
I think it goes back to that original point of just spending time with them first of all. And then I suppose it's on one level we would consult and advise based on their needs. I know later on we're going to talk about performance consultancy, but understanding what is the actual thing they're trying to achieve. Because the other flip side, now we're in a world where there's so many tools and so many things. So I suppose myself and the team, we could make an assumption that people knew what Zoom was, people knew what Teams was and how you could use it. And you and I may know that we can use Teams in a different way to Zoom, whereas some of our business didn't. On top of that, there's so many tools available. So you know, Miro as a tool, but then there's a similar tool in Microsoft Teams. We use lots of assessments in some of our business units do. So we're from Kahoot to Socrative to another kind of assessment within the LMS, and just spending time going through with them what the differences are and were. And then I think we spent time last year, particularly with our generation part of the business, just to define okay, we've got all this, we understand your problem, we've got this wonderful shopping list, this wonderful array of tools. What is success for you, and how can we measure that in terms of an impact? And then I think the next key step was just patiently working with them to show them how to use the tools, taking from a place of maybe us doing things and then transitioning to them doing things in small steps, so it wasn't a kind of subservient relationship. And because we're not a huge team, we can't create the digital learning for all of the business. It doesn't work that way. And then just spending time with both the senior stakeholders to make them aware of the journey we're going on, and just at regular stages reviewing that impact. And we're in a good place now. We're in a very good place now, probably in a place where we're starting to say, now we've got these tools, how can we use them? So we have examples last year, and hottest day of the year, people spending literally 9 to 5, 2 days in a row on a project management course. Whereas now we're starting to introduce things like asynchronous techniques. How could we use the chat functionality or community to practice in a different way to what we've done before?
And you're obviously on that journey, and you can't just flip the switch and turn on that. But What's most surprised you over that year in terms of things that have worked or haven't worked, or things people have embraced? Is there anything that stands out?
Oh, yeah, good question. Surprised me. Nothing surprised me in terms of how people perceive things and dealt with things, because I mentioned my teaching and then the teacher training background before. When I did the teacher training element, I kind of got to view everything of people's perceptions and what they feel and their kind of that behavior change with learning technology and various. So I've kind of seen and felt, maybe that's what I'm looking for. I felt that experience before. I suppose I was surprised with how quickly people knew they had to make the shift to digital. So some of those, like early on, we were working very late in the first couple of weeks when EDF shut down the offices and people started to work from home. I was surprised with how rapidly people wanted that support. And then I suppose I'm also being pleasantly pleased with that ongoing need. It wasn't just something we did in the first 6 weeks of lockdown. There is definitely a requirement for that to stay in place. And I'm pleased that our business units are fully bought into that this may well be a long-term thing. I'm unsure if it is going to be a long-term thing. Well, I'm unsure if at the earliest possibility people will revert or try and revert back to type. That's what I'm unsure of in our next phase. But I'm pleased we're having the conversation now.
And so picking up on that, reverting back to type, and do we find a hybrid? Do we stay more digitally led? Do we go back to a classroom based view? How do you think that decision is going to be made? Do you think it's just going to happen, or are you going to actually make a strategic decision as a business as to what you do?
Yeah, I mean, hybrid's the new waffle word, isn't it? On one level.
It is.
Yeah. What does it really mean? And weren't we, some of us, working in a hybrid world before the pandemic? My personal opinion is that, let's say I work for EDF, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the value. Ultimately, I work for my manager. My manager, my experience is going to be dependent on my manager. I think that's going to be an interesting challenge for lots of organizations. So if we've had someone who for 20 years have been in an office and have their team around them and want them around them, versus, let's say, a peer in their own department who's got a matrix team, matrix team based around the country, and they're happy to use Teams, and they might catch up every so often for their, coaching for performance type conversations. That's going to be very interesting. And I suppose what I'm talking about is that employee experience. Because I have a feeling from some, as soon as the restrictions were lifted, they wanted to get straight back into the swing of things, whereas others in teams didn't feel so comfortable. That's going to be an interesting challenge for lots of organizations, because I've not seen many companies who are extremely prescriptive with what they want in terms of the new ways of working, what the office environment might look like. Yeah, be in 2 days. I don't see anyone saying, well, actually, if everyone comes in 2 days, most people will probably come in either Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. And what does that look like for office capacity for the Monday and Friday? So I think there's a lot of detail and change to go through before we get a consistent way of accepting how people work and where they work, I should say.
Yeah, I think there's huge amounts for people to work through in terms of what does that mean? What's that mean for different types of teams, different stages of career, even, as you said, the obvious logical thing, and you see it with working from home anyway, people go, I'll be at home Monday, Friday, tag it onto the weekend. But will that become a different way of working? As you said, well, I'll go into the office Monday, Friday, crack on with some work in the middle of the week, and at home and be very productive and have my collaborative time just before the weekend. Again, there could be very different ways of embracing that, but we've seen across our clients and people we speak to, again, some people who are trying to be very prescriptive, through to the we're just sort of hunkering down, and if you want to go in the office, you can go in one day a week, and they're on rotas or different teams at the moment, as everyone's still sort of feeling through what that looks like. But it's weird, as people are starting to return to the office, it's starting to feel a little bit more normal to people, is the view that we're getting, because I think 18 months nearly stuck at home for some people has felt very alien, and so it's going to take a bit of time for what was before, going to a restaurant, going back to the office, all of those things are going to take a little bit of time to feel normal again for people, and then to think about what might be a sensible hybrid. And I know that's one of those words, but what's going to work for that business or that individual?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I think, because I've been involved with some conversations where saying, when they come into the office, but what about, how does this then affect policy? If you're going to have a serious conversation about someone's performance, do we then get them into the office to meet face to face? And all of a sudden, you go into the office, it's this horrible experience. Oh no, I've got to go into the office, and everyone knows what that means. That's a risk on one particular level. And then the flip side is, if we embrace openness, have meetings, it's hybrid, people aren't comfortable to travel, they don't need to travel. It's at what point do you say, actually, yeah, we need to catch up face to face? And at what time do companies get to that place of specificity? I think we have to go, definitely. As I mentioned to you before, I've been on my merry tour catching up with team members the last few weeks around the country, and it's been brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But I think there are going to be just lots of specific scenarios that come out that organisations are going to have to work through, really, and then provide a bit of a response in terms of clarity and direction for employees. Because again, all of this, we're talking about this broadly, but all of this impacts the learning and development department, doesn't it? Because in between all of this, we're trying to do, how does this then affect, the leadership program? How does this affect the other things we're trying to do as an organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. And not just the programs, but what are the abilities that our managers need? Because again, leading in an office with 20 people sat around you is very different to leading a remotely connected team. So again, there's both content or outcomes that we need to consider, but also delivery mechanisms and all of the rest of it. So it creates a lot of challenges for us as an industry to work through. And sat beyond the company politics is legislation, regulation, taxation. There's all sorts of things that come together to say, actually, what is going to be a sensible future. So I think for my takeaway is, people need to be really attuned to their business and thinking about what is it that we're needing, what is it that we're focusing on at the moment, because probably your leadership program from 2 years ago, if you're looking to resurrect it as soon as you can get back in the classroom, is likely to be a little bit obsolete. That's just my view. So touching on something we wanted to talk to you about, Lloyd, was performance consulting. And I know that's something that you've sort of brought into businesses or really focused on as part of your career. So do you want to talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose when I introduced myself, one of the things I said I'm really passionate about is delivering impact, and the department's not the same. My line manager's no different. So as a department, we've been focusing on performance consultancy probably for about 12 to 18 months solid. So the whole department going into a particular place. We had a mix before where I'll borrow some words from, I think I heard this from Laurie Nels-Hoffman in the past, but this kind of takeaway model of, we're like a McDonald's, a business asks us for something and we just deliver without asking any questions. We're transitioning from that to a place of, what's the impact you're trying to have? What are the facts you know about this? And just advising and asking maybe what might be perceived by some as challenging conversations, but in order to get to the end point. And it's been a fascinating journey. So I actually did my own podcast in 2018, and there was a chap on there called James Poletyllo who spoke about performance problem canvas, and it was brilliant. So we kind of taken some of that methodology and built what we call a project first steps. But for want of better terms, it's performance consultancy. Now, what's been great about that is we have the theory, but the practice has been the wonderful journey. We've been using a model called the Lencioni model that deals with kind of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And the reason we've been using that in alignment with performance consultancy, so please stick with me, is that conflict is one of the core dysfunctions of a team. And we're finding that one of our challenges has been certain team members are just having to have a lot of support and guidance to go through that conversation, go through that place where I feel really uncomfortable to challenge here, or I feel really uncomfortable to ask this question, or maybe I've worked in a business unit with these stakeholders for so many years, and now I'm being perceived as to ask, why do they need this particular intervention? What data do we need? Or we need more information before we can do anything, or even we're just saying, look, we don't think we can offer value here. We don't think it's training. So a lot of my conversations with team members have been dealing with that area. But also what's been fascinating is the core, so if the conflict is the kind of second level dysfunction, the bottom one is trust. So in our department, we've got so much trust in the department and individual team levels, but actually when we look at lateral trust, there's something missing. Wow, that was a big surprise to us. And the impact that has when we're having these performance consultancy conversations is huge, because our structure is very matrix, and we'll have kind of squads, groups, small groups working in multiple projects. And if those individuals in our department can't have those conversations laterally, how on earth can we then, well, that's going to have a direct impact on the outcomes, because people are sitting on their voice in their hands. And so we're currently working through that now in a much, much better place. We've done lots of workshops, but it's, for me, what's been a real learning curve is we can talk about how we do the performance consultancy, and I think we can talk about that for a while and everyone knows, but in practice for some people, it's a core behavior change.
I think it's a really interesting one, because I think back to my career, and I've probably been the anti-L&D person, because I think every conversation I've ever gone into is I've probably started off with, what you're probably asking for is not an L&D led solution. You're going to ask me, but I'm going to almost push back and ask a lot of questions straight away. And, I've been doing that for 20 years. I wouldn't have ever badged it as performance consultancy. I would have just badged it as trying to really get to the bottom of what the solution is, because, my view is always learning is never works in isolation in a business, because, you can train people and you can do all of those things. But if the whole rest of the system around the edges is not driving people to perform in a particular way, if the reward mechanisms, if the leadership behaviors, if the systems, if time or whatever else doesn't allow you to exhibit the behaviors we're wanting you to do, then you're starting off on a bit of a loser to start with, training people to do things that aren't going to work. And I think that came from me coming from a line management position, but also coming in and being that front line of training out to businesses that were very operational, and those people are looking at you going, this isn't going to work, our business, so as soon as you're in that and you understand the business, and I think that's really important for me, is that if learning people understand their business, and they often, the benefit for people in learning is they're that trusted person who in a traditional classroom or workshop environment would get that feedback that maybe you wouldn't hear elsewhere beyond a team. And I think I've always seen it as getting your team to understand, if you're going to stand up there, you've got to make sure that you are going to be selling something, not, or promoting something or talking about something that's going to work in your business. And you can only do that by understanding your business. And that's where I started from in my career, of not wanting to be the person selling you something that is nonsense, or talking about a business and trying to put in a new initiative that is going to fail because it's papering over the cracks of 100 different things. So that's where I started my sort of journey towards performance consulting, was from not wanting to be in that position. And then it just sort of evolved through my career as to getting people to think that it's unlikely to be a pure learning, it's not going to be a pure learning solution for many problems, and you need to be involved and interested in far more than learning if you're going to have a wider impact. That's been my approach in my career.
And I think, The analogy I use sometimes, or the example, is like our IT departments. Our IT departments, more often than not, get measured on deploying something, rather than the impact of it. And I think L&D teams, if they wanted to, could do that. But I actually think it's a case of you're just delaying pain further down the line. I think that's kind of where I come at it from it personally, and the fact that I think intrinsic to myself, I want to make a difference to people. So learning and development for me has been a way to do that. But I think there are some people in learning and development who are happy to take the order, but maybe don't realize they're just delaying the pain, because down the line, whenever the eye of Mordor may find us, right, if we've not delivered impact, we are then going to have questions. We've got some really interesting, we're really proud of some team members on their personal journey over the last 12 months. So, for example, a senior stakeholder wants to deploy a learning pathway to the whole department of 500 or 600 people, for us to go to a place of saying, you're telling us you want to achieve X, Y, Z, and from our experience, the way in which you do this, we know we're going to get probably 3 or 4% of people engaging with the pathway, let alone completing it, and then pausing, having that real conversation. That for me is a place that I think L&D needs to get to, and I really do believe that.
No, I absolutely agree with you. That ability to push back, that ability to partner with people, to ask the questions, to focus on what is it that you're there to achieve. Is that sales, performance, better onboarding, whatever it happens to be? Really get under what's going to help that challenge. And then I think it's also being able to step back and be quite analytical, like you said in that case, of being able to go, if you do all of that, this is the likely impact. Or, as I've had in the past, if I did all of this training you want to put all your people through, do you realize they'd be away from the business for 10 days next year? Is that the best use of 10 days of their time? And so I think there's, just being able to step back and reflect back to people the potential impact or lack of impact of what's being proposed is something, rather than saying, I think your solution is wrong. I think it's being able to work and negotiate with people to get them to focus in on what's the real thing they need to achieve, why, how's that going to be measured, and then get into the creativity of solutions, rather than the person coming up, as you said, however it's badged, the order taker or whatever it happens to be, that someone comes up and says, I want a leadership development program, I want a customer service program, I want whatever this happens to be. Because that keeps us busy, keeps us active, keeps some people churning around or on Zoom calls for the last year or whatever it happens to be. But what's the impact for the business? And that's a really important place to start.
And some of the other key point I wanted to mention on this is also then this kind of idea that we are disgruntling stakeholders, but clearly, as we've said, that's not the intention, and how we describe and articulate that is so important. And my learnings have been that people can do it with the best will in the world, but maybe we sometimes forget that still coming at that conversation from a stakeholder perspective, rather than we've got a process in our team that we need to follow, and what you're saying at the moment doesn't follow our process. That's the kind of journey we've been on as well, to say, no, we don't, they don't care about that. Our stakeholders don't care about that. Let's have a conversation about them and about solving their problems, and that what they're proposing isn't going to work, and break that down. And that's where data and data insights do help.
Absolutely. And I think, it's interesting you talked about people on that journey. So maybe you've been perceived in the past as a previous person who would turn up and do what was asked, and making that transition is challenging. It's easier to go into a new place where performance consulting is established and pick up that model. But if you're one of our listeners sat in a team and you're thinking, actually, I am being asked to do a load of stuff that isn't adding impact, or the pandemic has created an option for us to relaunch and not just put in what we've had for years and years and years. How does someone go into sort of starting with that conversation and going back and starting with the business to go, let's really refocus here. Let's look at that purpose. I think that's where a lot of people are going to be at the moment.
Exactly. Yeah.
So another thing I wanted to pick up with you on is tech in general, because you said that you're really interested in tech and you've been on that journey, and one of the things we see is we hear lots of different things about new tech coming into learning, and you have those people who go, okay, we must have the latest VR this, AR that, machine learning this, whatever it happens to be, so a bit of artificial intelligence. So I know that you've done some work with some of that tech in your businesses, and it'd be really good to understand some real world examples of where you should or shouldn't, or where it's worked, because again, tech shouldn't be faddy, it should be for a purpose. So I'd love to get your insights as to how you've approached some of that new tech coming into the market.
Yeah, for sure. I think use the word faddy there. It gets bashed around a lot, fairly and unfairly. Fairly because clearly lots of people talk about it, and hype is the word, I suppose. Hype things up. But at the same time, unfairly, because I think if people aren't thinking about the impact, should I start that? I'll start that again. My bloody phone off. I'll just turn the phone off. So I thought with the Apple, when talking about tech, I thought when you just put it face down, it didn't go off. So should I just start the bit about tech?
Yeah, just start the bit again. That's fine. Cool.
Yeah. So I think use the word fad, and that's fairly and unfairly used with tech. Fad because lots of people hype certain technologies up. Often we'll talk about a technology in such a broad term that we we don't specify it. AI is a wonderful example here, but as are a number of technologies. But also unfairly in the way that it can have an impact. So we've spoken about data in this call, but the key is one example, and I'll give you some other examples. But the key thing for me comes back to, it doesn't matter about what you're doing, it's the impact. What are we trying to achieve here? What is the problem that needs to be solved? And that is the best place to come at it from. I've spoken to lots of people from different organizations, for example, and they've spoken to me about a given technology, virtual reality is a common one, and it becomes very clear to me that they are talking to me because either A, they're trying to get justification just to use VR, or B, they're going to just go ahead and use VR and they're paying lip service talking to me. I think that those types of examples then don't help the conversation around what we're going to do. Now, I think if we're constantly focusing on impact, and I'm conscious I'm using my hands here to illustrate something, it's a podcast, but on one side of the spectrum, we're constantly focusing on impact. But the other, what's worked for us is just to spend a small amount of our time looking at specific pieces of technology to see if they could, and that's the key word, to see if they could have a potential impact, or if they could support some of our longer term business goals and challenges. Because it's quite often that it's never today's challenges that some of these pieces of technologies could solve. And I mentioned that for our context at EDF, because we've used technology in really niche case examples. And now exploring, horizon scanning, part of what's key for that for me is then informing stakeholders about the potential use cases, not overtly selling them, and then maybe for certain technologies as it matures to show them very small discrete examples. That is critical. And I'll give you an example of how that approach worked for us. So a number of years ago at one of our power stations, someone had a degloving incident. So the skin and the index finger were completely ripped off and they've just left with bone. Clearly, when people go to work, they need to return home safely. And that's at EDF, we've got a zero harm policy. Any company has a zero harm policy, right? When we then was approached by the station director, who had been part of this kind of promotions, marketing bit we've done just to educate them on the technology and the potential use cases. We did a showcase for some of our station directors. The station director got him and his team to get in touch with us in our kind of central department. We spent some time with them. What became clear was this was an extreme example, but it wasn't an isolated incident. There were a number of near misses that occurred. And the specific scenario was a kind of routine health and safety check. So we did a lot of, we had a lot of conversations, and we thought what would work well is if we laser scanned the power station, which was the first of its kind in a nuclear power station to my current understanding. And we had the certain checkpoints of the health and safety task. We could then identify where were the common points that people were making mistakes, and that enabled the power station afterwards to have specific conversations with individuals. But also, if there was something commonly missed, we could look at the data and then maybe run a more in-depth conversation or a workshop about some of those tasks. Now, we reduced lost time incidents. The lost time incidents equates to a lot of money for the power station, a lot of money lost, I should say. They were dramatically reduced. Only one person over 2 or 3 years had a lost time incident, and that was actually a contractor who didn't go through the training. And we had a total return on investment of around £200,000 to £250,000. And I give you the long example there because the bit I mentioned before about focusing on impact, about horizon scanning and being in touch with your business, informing stakeholders, but still then going through the niche detail, what was key. So that's one example.
Just picking that example back, it's aligning your learning back to that business outcome, the business measure, rather than just saying, right, we've done the bare minimum, we've ticked the box, we've done what's expected, or we've done something that's very fancy or whatever. You've actually pulled that back. You've got the business engaged. You know, obviously having an incident helps heighten awareness, but you've got that, the near misses, etc. So all of that data is telling you, like you said, it's not just written off as a one-off. You're actually looking at this and going, okay, how can we stop that, and how can we put those solutions in? And I absolutely agree, that's where learning teams should be in terms of aligning with the business at that level of detail, not just going, okay, we need to tick the box. And every business, as you said, should have no one should come to work and not go home safe. But again, different industries or different businesses play different amounts of, lip service or actual proper engagement with that message. And, I'm reassured to hear that the nuclear industry is slightly more engaged than some of the other businesses across the piece. But you'd be surprised again in other businesses how they almost don't take those risks quite seriously, or their own individual risks, which may not be potentially as catastrophic, but actually could be, because they might be risks around interpersonal interactions or whatever, but people aren't necessarily taking the same level of rigor or approach to thinking about how they can support the business and challenge those. Yeah,
and I think there's a couple of points just on what you said there. So what we don't often, well, first of all, we'll use words like push versus pull. We need that, especially with technology and innovation. What's the balance? But no one really talks about the detail of what that is. We stay just that level of push and pull. I think understanding what the push is for your business and how you can relate your kind of horizon scanning and your proof of concepts to your business is key. What do your stakeholders, what do your directors want to know to be informed? But the other thing is, people don't talk enough about when things go belly up. A number of years ago, we invested some money in some Google Glass, and we were thinking, so at that point, our smart meter, one of EDF's challenges as well is to deploy a number of smart meters to homes. And there's a new generation of smart meters, and the nuance is if someone goes in and there's a dog barking and a dog attacking them, it happens more than you'd think for a start. But also if they were installing a smart meter, maybe in an older house or a different house that they hadn't gone through their training with, how can they get information and stuff like this? So we thought, Google Glass, brilliant, this looks fantastic. Invested in some, tried it, very quickly realized that it's not, if you record a video, it's not going to last longer than 15 minutes. We were told to keep them cool. We had to put them in the fridge because they massively overheat. We're like, what? But we did this with our research and development teams. We said, look, this isn't a technology I think our business should go for. And that was then part of our communication in our updates to stakeholders and their teams. And that was removed, we didn't really even get to the point of proof of concept. We were just exploring the actual technology. It was kind of even at that earlier stage, but no one talks about that enough. I don't think no one and it's when we share those stories, I think, about what's not working. That's how we turn fads, into things that work. But then I suppose we come back to this point of you have to be coming from a perspective of impact. How is this going to improve business and business performance?
And I think you've clearly got sort of a sensible, rigorous approach to looking at new tech as it comes in. So, if someone is sat there, hearing about lots of stuff, or, as will happen in some businesses, someone will turn around at a senior level and say, why aren't we using this, or should we be doing this, etc. How would you recommend people approach or keep up to date with all the things that are changing? Because people are busy. So what approach should people take in keeping up to date and checking out something new that they haven't used before or heard about?
Yeah, good question. I think in terms of keeping up to date, there are multiple sources you can use. I think so what I try and do is keep up to date at a superficial level, and then when I'm curious, I'll then dive deeper. And so I suppose at the curiosity level, your basic magazines of Wired, I'm a big fan of, MIT, the journal there, but also I think LinkedIn as a platform is great. So you can kind of, what I found a few years ago, my platform, after I did the podcast, it was a lot of more followers and a lot more connections, which is great, but I wasn't always seeing stories and updates I wanted to see. And I heard someone use a phrase, de-weed, de-weed the platform, so you can curate your LinkedIn platform to give you specific updates. And I'm now following a lot of individuals and organizations that give me that. You can obviously get your trend reports from organizations like Gartner in particular, and there's a host of others. But I'm also curious to see how other day-to-day technology could then fit in with business goals. For example, I've got my Apple Watch and Apple products, and I've been following with intrigue about how that technology is going to evolve. And I think part of it is just trying to join the dot up yourself. But in order to join the dot up yourself, you do need to know what's going on with your business. What are their key drivers, KPIs? What are they focusing on long term? So, for example, we do a lot of simulation at EDF. Homer Simpson's job in the power plant, right? He makes it look a lot easier than it probably is, as well as the training. And it's critically important, I know, as we build new power stations in Hinkley Point C and potentially other places in the country, that people with new technologies understand how to use them in pressurized environments. Now we can go through tests and we can go through processes, and I come back to my Apple analogy, is that they're investing heavily into the kind of health data. So on the latest, I saw on LinkedIn the other day, someone had shared a post where they had received a notification that they had trouble with one of the ECG scans that's built into the watch. And they've subsequently gone to the GP and are going to be in surgery in 6 weeks. What a wonderful story, first of all. And as that technology evolves, maybe they can detect, they can now detect blood oxygen levels. I'd imagine, and I know from their future iterations, blood pressure and other physiological requirements. We can then put that into the simulation environment. I know that is going to help run a more effective and safe power station. It's going to help those technical instructors deliver that content to those individuals who are learning. It might also help to understand what is the most pressurized part of working in the power room as well. So I gave you a long answer there, James. I'm very passionate about this topic, so forgive the length of that.
No, I think that's really interesting because, even taking that holistic view of how you approach that. So, taking that health data to understand maybe where people feel more stressed or where processes are more challenged, or, you can even pick up confidence levels and all sorts of things. That there's huge potential there to actually use data technology wider than just traditional learning tech to help improve the performance, the engagement, the health, the well-being, the collaboration, whatever it happens to be. And I think like you said, it's coming back to having the root goal for what you're trying to achieve or the organization's trying to achieve, and then being creative and probably just not looking through your own necessarily silo view of, I'm just interested or listening to deliver some learning interventions, but I'm thinking about what's the best way that we and collectively can deliver that support to people. And that horizon scanning, that being interested, testing things out, I think is a great way to be, and that's where the creativity and some of the things you're talking about might get other people's thinking, how can that work in another environment? I go back to a completely different environment, that I worked in, say care, where you've got, again, people going onto other people's premises, where you've got people who are remote working, who might not see their manager, who are dealing with extremely stressful and challenging situations on a daily basis. And actually the ability to not just ask them how they are, but to have some ability for that person to engage. There's huge possibilities for me in terms of looking at synergies across organizations, because organizations like yourself, you've got people going into people's homes, people in that industry. You look, there's more commonality across industries than sometimes we'll realize, and that sharing of best practice sometimes doesn't get beyond an industry silo or even an organizational one. So I think there's some really exciting thoughts you've just sparked in me there, just from your very long answer, but no, really good.
Very good.
So you're at the point of moving on to a new challenge, or about to move on to a new challenge. So what next for you in your career, and what are you looking forward to getting your teeth into?
Yes. So I am going to be leaving EDF at the end of September, and I'll be joining an organisation called PA Consulting. It's for me a place of excitement and being scared at the same time, because you're excited for the learning and the growth in a new role. But like every human being, I say every, but for me, there's this kind of imposter syndrome narrative going in my head. So I'm just dealing with that, and just as you do. EDF is a great company to work for. I've led amazing people and work with great and for great people. It's been going really well for me, the organisation. I'm really proud of the successes that myself and the team have delivered. I'm just ready for a new challenge and a new change, and just to be honest with you, just really excited about. I know we're having this conversation early August, so by the time this goes out, I may have figured out the role a little bit more, but just really excited for this next step in my career, to be honest.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to follow your journey and to see what happens next. And as you step out of that world of EDF into, PA consulting. So if people do want to follow you and keep in touch and maybe see some of your insights or share some of the things that you're interested in, what's the best way of them doing that?
I've got a few social media accounts, but the best, if you follow me on Twitter, you're probably just going to see some rambles about Tottenham Hotspur and yes, Harry Kane potentially leaving the club. But probably the best place to get hold of me is on LinkedIn. I'm relatively active on the platform, but also very responsive on there as well.
And we'll make sure your details are in the show notes below. Lloyd, it's been brilliant to have you on today. So thank you very much for all of your insights. And, I'm sure we could go on and talk for a lot further about, whether that's how you have an impact in business or some of the tech that you've put in. But no, I think it's been really insightful. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, James, for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Learning Reinvented podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've not already done so, please follow our podcast. And if the learning effect can help you and your organisation, please do get in touch. You can find both James and Katie on LinkedIn, and our contact details are in the show notes below.